Kratos, the killer of Hercules, Hades, Poseidon, Zeus, and countless other gods, Kratos, the god of war, is a dad. In 2018, God of War came out to glowing reception as well as winning Game of the Year for most publications while going up against some crazy competition in Celeste, Monster Hunter World, Marvel Spider-Man, Red Dead Redemption 2, in some cases Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, and let's not forget Fallout 76. Well, that last one is a bit of a joke, but to win Game of the Year against such fierce competition is mighty impressive. Fitting of a god, should I say. In all seriousness, this game was not on my radar prior to December of 2018. I knew it existed, and based off the poster, I could tell it was taking a new direction, but I had no interest in playing it due to not really having any connection with this franchise. I watched and played a little bit of God of War 2 at a friend's house back in the day, but I never gave it enough time to really follow the story, understand the potential nuances in combat, since the square button seemed to be my best friend. At this point, I still haven't played any of the prior games, but I figured the 2018 title would be as good as any to jump onto, especially with the highly anticipated sequel just around the corner. I think this goes without saying, but there will be spoilers for 2018's God of War. But yeah, it's 2022, and I just finished playing God of War for the very first time, and I definitely have some opinions, so let's get into it. Before playing, I heard a quote that really stood out to me by the director of the game, Cory Barlog, and that's, "Simple story with complex characters." That one quote had me looking at some of my favorite works of fiction in a new light, while also being very applicable here. Kratos and Atreus have the singular goal of getting to the highest point of all the lands to spread the ashes of their recently departed loved one. Of course, there are a lot of twists and turns along the way, but this singular goal is what keeps the story grounded while giving room to explore each character in great depth. You can count on two hands all the characters you end up meeting along the journey, while also learning of many more of past and potentially the future. Between ancient shrines, boat time stories, and optional side content, the world building here is top notch. I often found myself invested in the why of everything. Why did the stranger attack Kratos? Why is this witch living under a giant turtle by herself? Why is this giant frozen in the snow? The mark of great world building, I personally found myself invested into the history behind just about everything. Given the plot and characters involved, I was pleasantly surprised at how often I was grinning and laughing. Being another sign of spot-on writing, every character got a laugh out of me at some point or another. Sindri with his over-the-top germophobic nature.
Yeah, I am not touching that. Just hold it out.
Brock with his grumpy old man, what are you smiling about attitude.
Rock! Rock!
What? I'm on a fucking break. Don't hear me screeching at you whenever you're twiddling your short and curlies.
Mimir had plenty of witty, sarcastic one-liners.
I guess waking up to see it was worse than the thought of lumps of solid stone passing through his gullet. You want me to ask him?
No.
While Atreus brought a childlike wonder, questioning everything, including the uncomfortable questions.
That was impressive. You didn't hurt your back, did you?
I did not hurt my back.
And then there's Kratos with his blunt, dry, and literal answers.
So you value your privacy more than your son, eh?
I'm going to cut off your head now.
Fair enough.
You see these clashes of personalities at play many times throughout the journey. One of my favorites was Kratos' attempt to tell a good story. We get several hilariously failed attempts that eventually culminates in the rewarding moment of Kratos revealing the story of the Spartan warrior Atreus, whom he named his son after. It's these little moments that add up to the successful portrayal of this challenging relationship. Moments like hearing the worry in Kratos' voice after he loses sight of his son for just a brief moment in combat, or when Atreus was sick and you see the non-verbal distress consuming Kratos through his body language. This level of storytelling reminds you that games can be looked at on the same level as film or television. The game does a fantastic job of introducing only a few characters while giving each of them their own fleshed out arcs. And while the game spends a fair amount of time getting to know all of these characters of past and present, It never loses its primary focus of Kratos and Atreus' relationship with their simple yet difficult goal driving the plot forward. In all honesty, the only part of the narrative that felt off to me was Atreus' turn to the dark side. The idea was great and rather essential to the story, but I think he became way too big of a jerk way too quick, just to mellow out in almost no time. It just kind of felt off to see Atreus go from a sweet, compassionate kid who struggles to kill a deer to then an impatient bully implying all their life is meaningless after learning that he is a god. Of course, the idea of power getting to one's head makes complete sense, but not to this extreme so quickly. Other aspects of his temporary transformation did feel natural to me, like his disobedience towards his father, his overconfidence, and his desire to stay up late and eat ice cream without consequences. In my opinion, I think dialing down his bad attitude to like 3/4 stretched over double the game time would have made the arc feel more natural. Luckily, the writing is so good it didn't ultimately hurt the story that much, if at all. Santa Monica Studios puts all their eggs in the basket of this dysfunctional father-son relationship, which has ultimately paid dividends. This successful dynamic is greatly attributed to a combination of great direction, script writing, and performances.
I wouldn't even care if she was.
Mind your tongue, boy! Until our journey is over, one of us must remain focused. Do not mistake my silence for lack of grief. Mourn how you wish. Leave me to my own.
Playing God of War in 2022 on my PS5 looks great at a solid 60 frames per second. I'm probably not as wowed by it as if I had played it at launch due to being recently spoiled by the visual fidelity of games like the PS5 versions of Death Stranding, Ghost of Tsushima, Astro's Playroom, Forza Horizon 5, and Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, but that isn't to say it doesn't look great. Similar to the more recent Elden Ring, God of War pushes the boundaries with outstanding art direction that pulls you into its world. The music also assists in grabbing your attention without letting go. The main theme instilled in me a chilling feeling of purpose and power against a grand threat, reminding me of other classic themes found in titles like Halo or Skyrim. I don't know if that makes sense, but I just think God of War's soundtrack does a great job of representing the struggle. The outstanding performances and writing are also translated well into animation that remind you that this is full-on performance acting, which adds a ton to the immersion factor. The initially interesting choice to use a single camera shot also contributes a lot to that feeling of engrossment. Cutscenes and combats feel very intimate this way, striking a fascinating middle ground that gives player a very cinematic third-person look, while also feeling as connected as if it was a first-person point of view. It's not perfect, with a handful of moments that had me unsure of where I was in relation to enemies, but still a great creative decision overall in my opinion. While I'm talking about the single camera shot, I also want to talk about the set pieces and cinematography here. The moment I personally fell in love with this game was the very first epic battle between Kratos and the stranger who we would later learn to be Boulder. This fight scene felt like something pulled straight out of Dragon Ball Z or an Avengers movie with its mix of land-altering destruction and epic momentum shifts. This sequence also swapped between playable combat and cinematic set pieces seamlessly, which is largely attributed to that single camera shot. Being a child whose favorite show growing up was Dragon Ball Z, while also having a background in several martial arts, I love this whole fight for finding a great balance of entertaining over-the-top destruction with some more grounded and practical techniques. This wasn't the only jaw-dropping moment for me, but it's definitely the first of several. The other two Boulder fights equally stood out to me, but another action sequence worth mentioning was going up against the Dragon of the Mountain. The feeling of scale was effectively used in this moment along several others throughout, adding this grand sense of adventure throughout. The feeling of scale here is effectively used in this moment along with several others, adding to the sense of a grand adventure, although I would have liked to have seen a few more. Back to the camera, I'm not really a big fan of over-the-top shaky action cinema, but I felt there was just enough sway in the camera's movement to feel natural without getting lazy on framing subjects. There were a lot of neat and creative uses of movement and framing that stood out to me. From the set pieces to camera placement, God of War definitely checks off the boxes when it comes to great action, but at the end of the day, none of that matters if the gameplay isn't fun. Luckily it is. God of War has 3 pillars of gameplay: combat, puzzles, and exploration, with all of them delivering in my opinion. The biggest area that this game excels in is easily combat, and rightfully so for being a game called God of War. Kratos is straight up a badass from the moment go, while also expanding his epic abilities as the journey unfolds. In a very conventional sense, Kratos has a light attack, heavy attack, and various special moves mixed in with dodging, rolling, blocking, and parrying. All these aspects are executed well. Unconventionally, Kratos also has other ranges covered. Close range is addressed by the Leviathan axe and basic hand-to-hand. Mid-range is dominated by the Blades of Chaos, while the Leviathan axe can be thrown like a projectile to cover long range. Not to be forgotten, Atreus also helps to cover all the ranges with his bow and summons. I can't think of another game that owns combat so authoritatively in so many ranges as God of War does. This Axe of the Gods is easily one of my new favorite weapons in any game. Every throw and swing feels so deliberate and impactful. Having a separate button to recall also greatly adds to that deliberate feeling. Between the visuals, sound effect, and controller vibration, everything feels in chorus. It was so fun I'd often just be thrown at random stuff just because. The basic gameplay loop left me more than satisfied, but as you progress, you unlock many cool and creative moves and combos that add another layer to your creative expression in combat. Sony Santa Monica could have easily gotten away with just the axe for being as good as it is, but they also reintroduced Kratos' signature weapon, the Blades of Chaos. With one of the best narrative sequences leading up to the retrieval of the blades, these bad boys serve as the perfect yin to the axe's yang. As I mentioned earlier, the blades dominate in a complementary range, but also contrast with the element of fire compared to ice. I found the blades to encourage a more aggressive approach out of me, while the axe emphasizes more deliberate shot selection. These two weapons both thrive during specific matchups, while also allowing the player to have a preference. Beyond combat, the Leviathan axe and Blades of Chaos were great tools in solving various puzzles. The puzzles start out on the simple side, which had me a little worried for their longevity. Fortunately, they never ended up being a problem, with each new puzzle scaling up nicely according to your knowledge and abilities as the player. I'm not a huge puzzle guy, but found God of War's implementation to strike a great balance that challenged me without making me feel like I had to painstakingly stumble upon the answer as if some sort of sadist designed them. Since I'm generally not a huge puzzle guy, outside of maybe the context of a game like this, it's hard to say how someone who's more puzzle savvy than me may feel about the difficulty here. Since the game breaks up the puzzle sections with combat, exploration, and cinematics, I wouldn't have minded a few harder ones thrown in. There were a few times I got stuck for a brief moment due to missing some crucial bit of information in my environment, but I never actually had to do the Google search of shame. Exploration is the third pillar of gameplay, which fills in much of the in-between from combat to puzzles. For a 2022 first-party PlayStation exclusive, the climbing is on the good end of generic. In 2018, the mechanic would have felt a little less copy and pasted, with Horizon Zero Dawn being the only obvious comparison. Later learning that Fake left all these predetermined action markers across the realms was kind of a neat gameplay tie-in to the story. Despite being a modern, narrative-driven action-adventure game, God of War is not open world, but rather wide linear, which is refreshing in an oversaturated genre. This wide linear design isn't necessarily better than open world, but is just different with its own pros and cons. The main pro here is the ability for creators to more carefully and purposely handcraft every aspect of a level, as well as curating the overall experience. Now, the main downside I found present was a lack of freedom at times, which I think most would consider to be a fair trade-off. This lack of freedom felt too present in my opinion, with area borders being a little too easy to stumble across without even trying. Of course, just about any game outside of a randomly generated one has borders of some sort, regardless of its size and scope, but it just kind of feels weird when Kratos has this invisible wall stopping him from touching water or a bush to go down a path. In most games, this doesn't feel as out of place due to most protagonists not being a god of war. These borders also stood out to me more than most because of how engrossed I was while playing. In a weird kind of way, I'm complimenting the game for being so immersive and engaging. I felt extra put off by the commonly used barrier system that is utilized in many other games. I think expanding the overall width of each path while still placing passable barriers to encourage players to stay on course could have helped. In somewhat of a similar vein, smashing random orbs off the ground to regain health felt a little old school to me. I can't say it's bad, but I also can't help but wonder how a well-tuned dynamic health bar could have been used instead. It took me most of my playthrough to get used to the in-game menus and upgrade systems, but this is also an area I can't say I put a lot of effort into getting familiarized with, since I just wanted to get back to the adventure. Another area where this game excels is in its pacing. While applying to the narrative, I'm specifically talking about the pacing of new gameplay elements added in. God of War doesn't overload you with a tutorial section before setting you off on your own at the 3-hour mark. Rather, you are slowly but consistently learning how to implement new tools and techniques, and so I never felt bogged down by too much new information. The pacing had me feeling comfortable with my tool set while consistently rewarding me with new abilities. As a whole package, the gameplay of God of War is best described as rewarding. Between the discovery of hidden locations and chests, with puzzles that had me think and combat that had me on my toes, there was almost nothing to do besides have fun. God of War is extremely disciplined in every aspect of the experience, from narrative, puzzles, exploration, and combat. While I was playing, I kept comparing my experience to other beloved games, not to say that this title doesn't stand on its own, but I found it does a lot of things that other games do, but better, at least for my gaming preferences. A lot of this is my personal taste showing, but to me, God of War takes aspects of exploration and puzzle solving from a typical Zelda game, but adds amazing combat and a story I cared about. The enemies are almost as varied and challenging as a FromSoft game, but with controls that actually feel satisfying to use, as well as encouraging you to get good. The adventure and roller coaster of a story somewhat reminded me of a classic Halo, but with even better dialogue. I'm not saying any of those other games are bad, and in many ways, due to age and genre, they're not even comparable. But God of War is definitely a special game. 2018's God of War is not perfect, but I think it's one of those rare games where everything it does is either good, great, or amazing. I played through the game rather casually, and so this isn't a full-on review, but if I were to score it, it'd easily be considered somewhere around a 9. This game is the result of great storytelling married to great gameplay. There is no one game for everybody, but this is easily one of those games everyone should try at least once if you're a PlayStation owner, and I guess now PC player too. But what are your thoughts on 2018's God of War and the sequel? I'm probably going to post another video about the sequel before it's released in November, so keep a lookout for that. As always, I appreciate you all for watching, and until next time, see ya!